This is Debrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Welcome to Debrief, the podcast that explains industry to policymakers and government policy to industry, and is driven by the Australian Industry Group's mission, which is to empower industry success for a better Australia. My name is Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy, and I'm joined by Jeff Wilson, Head of Research and Economics. Hello, Jeff.
Hi, Louise. How are you going?
Now, last week we published our annual report into the state of manufacturing industry in Australia, which was well received by many people. A lot of people feel very passionate about Australian manufacturing. But Jeff, before you start on your excellent analysis, can I just be indulged to give my 2 cents on manufacturing?
Of course.
So I think manufacturing has a reputation problem in Australia. It has a reputation for sort of the general populace that it's still dull, dirty and dangerous. I would argue that it's actually digital, diversified and increasingly decarbonised. But it's not just that there's this image problem. My background's linguistics. Language is important, words are important, and the word manufacturing carries such a heavy load. It represents everything from making cheese to making rockets. And if you say the word manufacturing, everyone has an image in their mind, but it does not at all encompass the full gamut of what manufacturing is. And I think, well, as we'll see in your data, Jeff, in my mind, there's 3 broad groups of manufacturing. There's low intensity in terms of skills and technology. So making fasteners, which is nuts and bolts to everyone else, and extruded products, things that don't require sort of that high tech that dictates a lot of Australian manufacturing. Then you've got mid-levels of technology and innovation. So passenger car assembly, for example, that just doesn't cut it in Australia because we're too small of a market without significant subsidisation. But the things that you really care about in the car, like your brake pads, gearboxes, those things that require high levels of innovation, high levels of skill in all levels of the company, they are not just surviving in the Australian market, they are thriving, and their exports have doubled over the last 20 years. Not to say they're not operating in a tough environment. Anything that you put in or on your body, health care, vitamins, food, highly regulated industries, they do well, and they're certainly thriving. But the message, though, I guess, Jeff, from your report is that life for an average manufacturer, wherever they are on that scale of innovation and skills, is pretty tough.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. And it is. And I guess that language point's an important one because when people think of manufacturing, they think of a man going to a factory, carrying a little lunchbox and hitting metal all day. And I do think of that because my grandfathers both went to a factory with a little metal lunchbox and hit metal every day. But you know, this isn't what we're seeing in the industry. It has no connection to really that imagination of 2 generations ago is not the industry we're talking about today. But, I mean, just on that point, you know, we looked into this report I'll talk about in a second. You'd be surprised the outsized contribution manufacturing has in Australia. It's the 6th largest of 17 industries in Australia. It employs nearly 1 million people. It has double it produces 8% of our investment, but it's only 5% of our GDP, 12% of exports, and it's the most R&D intensive industry in Australia. So this is not old men hitting metal with hammers all day at those kind of things, which is where we get to the problem. Because manufacturing has had a really tough last 12 months over the last financial year. You know, the industry did have a bit of a boost during COVID when supply chain challenges globally made Australia ran out a lot of stuff, which gave a little bit of an artificial boost. But over about the middle of 2024, manufacturing in Australia went into recession. Pretty much every part of the industry was affected, particularly the petrochemical sector and also machinery and equipment, which is where a lot of those high-value, high-tech manufacturers that Louise, you were just talking about, come in. What we do in this report is try and understand why that is. So the other thing I'll add is that actually means that manufacturing is the 2nd worst performing industry in Australia over the last 12 months. Mining had slightly a worse year because gas and iron ore prices came down. But by and large, manufacturing had the worst year of any industry in Australia. So we're trying to ask this question, well, what's going on for manufacturing that's made it so hard?
So Jeff, just on being the worst performing? Is that in terms of growth, profitability, competitiveness, productivity? Which metric are you using for that?
Excellent clarification. That's in industry growth, but there is knock-on impacts across the board. So investment levels came down as a result of that. Operating margin, profitability is a bit tricky because it depends on your tax status, but gross operating margin fell in the industry. It did shed some employees as well over the last 12 months, and it was one of the few industries to do that. But yeah, certainly we've seen output has fallen compared to where we were 12 months ago.
And the only bright spark, I think, is that food and beverage sector. As I said, though, in or on your body can be still internationally competitive.
But still having a hard time. Stuck out a 1% growth rate when it was about 2% across the rest of industries there. But we tried to understand why this is. So why has manufacturing uniquely had a tough 12 months? And with a couple of key factors. One's inflation for cost coming into Australian manufacturing. Now, they've gone up really dramatically. Since the start of the pandemic, we've had high inflation in Australia, and industrial prices have gone up 20% in the last 5 years. But manufacturers' input costs have gone up nearly double that, so 37.5% over the last 5 years. And a big part of this is energy, particularly gas prices. They jumped up in 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which led to global energy prices surging. But unfortunately, we haven't seen them come back down. And so manufacturers are still paying 48% more for gas than they did 5 years ago. For a lot of parts of Australian manufacturing, both the old, heavy, heat-intensive parts, but even other parts in the supply chain that have to buy those products as well, this has been really hard to take. Cheap energy is one of Australia's draw cards. As for our manufacturing competitiveness. And that advantage has really been pulled out by those issues about really high local gas prices.
And if we think about the food manufacturing sector, the food processing sector, I know for a fact that many have moved really as far down the decarbonisation path as they possibly can, introducing solar. They don't need the same intensity of heat that, certainly metals, foundries and those sorts of and they also don't need gas as a feedstock.
It's petrochemicals, yeah. So and we see that in the industry performance. Those are the most exposed to energy prices, have had the hardest time. Well, the other part that's a large challenge at the same time has been skills shortages in the labour market. So we've had a really tight labour market in Australia since the pandemic, the tightest labour market since the 1970s. But this has been particularly hard for manufacturers because the area of the labour market where we have the biggest workforce shortages is in technical and trades roles. And indeed, at technical and trades roles, the current data says 61% of recruitments for technical and trades roles suffer difficulty. So this is when a business advertises for a job and can't get someone to fill it within the standard period. So it's almost a 2/3 failure rate. And that shows how few of those roles there are. Now, that affects everyone in Australia, but it's especially bad for manufacturing because those roles are about a quarter of the manufacturing workforce and often in the key positions, an engineering position on the shop floor or developing new products. So that technical and trades shortages in Australia, which also affect construction, have really weighed on manufacturing in a way that it hasn't weighed on other industries.
And so despite people going with the mantra, we don't make anything in Australia anymore, and as you say, Jeff, there's at least 1 million people apparently not making anything in Australia. It could actually be larger because if you're saying a quarter, is it a quarter of the role? So do we think then there should be 1.25 million people working in manufacturing? Is that the theory?
There could certainly be more. There's a lot of, there's surprisingly, and this is interesting, an industry that is suffering a recession still has thousands of vacant jobs. And this is how we understand this tension, is that the industry just cannot, even when it's in recession, can't fill all those technical and trades roles that it needs to be able to do, which is for anyone who's ever run a business. So you'd know the pain of, I'd need someone with a particular set of technical skills. We need 2 people to cover all the shifts. One of them leaves, the other person tries to cover it. It goes on for a week, but after a while, that starts to become an existential problem for your business. Even if that employs 1 of 50 or 1 of 100, the impact of that can be really significant on efficiency, growth, all of those things.
And it's also just crucial in how we bring new entrants into the sector, because those people who are working are too valuable to be taken off the tools to then train the next generation. And so we're actually in a spiral of shrinking opportunities for people to get into manufacturing.
The only other one we'd point to is the trade aspect as well, which is a lot of industries in Australia have this, but manufacturing is very trade exposed. It's either exports, particularly in the high end, where our manufacturers are global exporters of high value, high IP products, or at some of those lower ends, still, Louise, it's having to compete with imports from other countries, which may receive subsidies, guaranteed to have lower wage costs, probably now lower energy costs as well. And so compared to other industrial sectors like construction, manufacturing's much more exposed to trade pressures. So when it has high energy costs and big workforce shortages, it can't necessarily pass those costs on to customers in the same way, like house builders can you just put it higher on a quote for the house building job, right? Manufacturers can't just pass it on to the customer in the same way that others can because of their trade exposure.
But if we think of some bright sparks, because it's always good to look at the opportunities, and we think about those companies I talked about in the intro, which is those high-tech, high-skilled, our investment in R&D is the highest, which is critical for competitive nature of the sector. Talk a bit about that. How does that manifest itself in the sector?
Well, and this is what we see. Manufacturing has the highest R&D rate of any industry in Australia. So the data says 4.1% of value add. So not just profits, but 4.1% of total value generated by the industry gets reinvested in R&D. That's a huge amount. And in fact, it's one of only three industries, the ICT, the finance sector and the professional services sector. Just those three do almost all the country's business R&D in just 3 of the 17 industries. A lot of that reflects that exposure to pressures, that you're either in a global market competing with the cutting edge or you're competing with imports. You do have high labour costs. You do have skills shortages. You do now have high energy costs in Australia over the last 5 years. So how do you survive? It is a little bit survival of the fittest in Australian manufacturing, but that's what we have. We have an industry that's very intensive in investment, very intensive in R&D, because it's been subject to these competitive pressures like no others. And it raises a question, not just for the about 1 million employees in the industry, but when you see manufacturing go into recession, that has big impacts for Australia's R&D effort. Because if the industry is the most intense, well, who else is going to come and step in and fill that void? So we've certainly put this research out ahead of, talk about it, the Treasury's Economic Reform Roundtable. It's coming up in just under 3 weeks. But there's a real question when we think about R&D and innovations, making sure, and we recognise the role manufacturing's outsized role it's got in that, but also address this issue of if the industry is in a recession, is it going to be able to sustain those innovation and R&D rates over the next 12, 18 months? And what can we do to get it back on track?
And our response is there's no point just putting out this report with all these problems and not having some answers or some solutions. So Kenneth Reid, our Director for Climate and Energy, put out a paper about supply and demand of energy. And David Martin, our Director for Emerging Industries and Innovation, also has got a blueprint for R&D and how we can lift that. And I think, Jeff, when I'm on very badly timed to leave in the fortnight, you'll be talking to David and Tennant about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Louise, this is also an issue for circular economy materials here, right? Which is a big R&D manufacturing push.
It is. And we'll talk about that just after the break.
The largest Australian workplace changes in over a decade
Underpaying workers could result in crippling fines.
There'll be new rules about when a casual employee has the right
employees will have the right
to disconnect.
Workplace laws are changing. Pay attention or pay the price. Safeguard your business with Australian Industry Group. The legal experts at Australian Industry Group will help you navigate the new legislation and prepare your business for the changes. Become a member today at aigroup.com.au.
Welcome back to Debrief, and I'm here talking with Louise McGrath about all things manufacturing this week. Louise, we have just discussed some of the difficulties that manufacturing's had over the last 12 months, energy, skills, trade. But also R&D, and there's a lot going on in Australian manufacturing that's kind of positioning itself for some of these competitive pressures. One of those is in the circular economy space, particularly around materials and materials productivity, where manufacturing is leading and could do more. We've got a position paper coming out regarding some of this very soon. Could you talk us through it?
Yes, well, as I said in the outset, I think Australian manufacturing is increasingly becoming decarbonised, but there is a way to go, and government regulation and support will help that transition. We wanted to put out a paper on material productivity because when people think about productivity, they might think about, or they always think about, what a person is doing and how many widgets they can put through the system. They might think about finance or capital productivity. But we wanted to just also put in this concept of material productivity, which, as you say, links to the circular economy agenda. And it's around trying to get a triple dividend, boosting growth in value creation, cutting impacts on climate and the environment, and building supply chain resilience through creating locally accessible inputs from recovered and recycled inputs. So we really think that circularity is crucial to our net zero ambitions. Around 20% of global emissions are associated with making industrial products and another 24% with producing food. So if we can get some near-term emissions reductions in materials efficiency and enhanced recycling, there could be really substantial impact on our net zero ambitions. And we have to think of it as the economy as a whole. So we've got, as you say, Jeff, we've got a paper out. We've already put it into the mix for the Economic Reform Roundtable, I think is what it's been called this week. The first recommendation is to think about mandating a product stewardship scheme for solar, photovoltaics and peripheral products. Australia's take-up of solar has been extraordinary at the household level. We lead the world. Some of those panels, though, are getting a bit old and coming to the end of their useful life. And we have to think about what we're going to do. And it's not just a matter of, well, we can just throw them in the bin and hope for the best. There's a lot of really critical minerals and rare earth products that are embedded in these products. So how do we extract them? When we think about our resource management and resource extraction, we always think about mining raw materials. We also have to think more carefully about how we extract or mine these critical minerals from existing products and how we can circulate them. So steel and aluminium, well advanced on circular economy conversation. So it's how do we get these new products also positioned well for that as well.
Well, Louise, there's a high and low value aspect there because, steel and aluminium are advanced because at some level recycling is, it's not, I wouldn't say it's straightforward, but it's relatively, you melt it, Yeah,
that's it.
pulling gallium out of electronics or, germanium out of a solar panel or something is a very different proposition as a recycler than it is for steel, even plastics and fibre as well. So this is this part of the whole, like the high value, like Australian manufacturing and even high end applications?
It is, but it's also around getting volume because, there's different grades of steel, but, you can manage that. One of the challenges for packaging recycling is, there's a number of challenges. One is that there's different state regulations, but the other is that on the whole, we're an importer of packaging, which means we're not really controlling the makeup of that packaging. And there's only so many times you can recycle polymers when they don't, I'm not a scientist, or chemist, but they further split and you can't actually use them. You can't use them in food situations for food packaging. You also sometimes can't use them if consumers are likely to microwave the product. There's a whole range of issues. And you can put don't microwave, but, people don't.
People do. People do. Have you ever checked? I've never checked.
No. Not until after I've fed it to my child. So we really think that the government should complete its work on packaging regulation reform and support market development for recyclate derived from packaging waste. And a big part of that is this Recycled in Australia product. And I noticed that Made in Australia announced that they've got a new logo for a product that's made in Australia using Australian recycled product. And part of the circular economy material uptake is also thinking around removing barriers to use for fit-for-purpose recycled inputs in publicly funded projects. Using recycled products in the built environment, has been sort of, well, we've got a big hole to fill, we'll chuck it with rubbish and then put something over it and bang, we've recycled it. We also have to think around how we reuse these plastics. There's a big push to use them in playgrounds, and there's some case studies where that hasn't worked so well. But the science is improving, experience is improving, and we need to get the local government engineers, et cetera, to expand their thinking and to work with industry to make sure we are using more recycled materials in the built environment.
Well, Louise, that sounds like supply chain regulations here, which is that one that probably our favourite topic. You couldn't do a debrief without talking about supply chain regulation and dysregulation. Well, when we think about this, we're also thinking about, because it does come back to those questions around supply chain regulation, product standards, in for major projects, some of these things. And this is something that's really come up it's going to be a big deal for the Economic Reform Roundtable in a couple of weeks. We've all read Abundance. We've discovered red tape again. And there's been people talk about it in the construction industry, which is a good case study, but it's not just a house building thing, supply chain regulations, right? And so we're going to be getting some stuff out pretty soon about that as well. How do we do this a bit better?
Yes. Well, my other soapbox isn't just on the definition of manufacturing, but it's also on this supply chain regulation issue. We're finding that, particularly in ESG related regulations, that governments are imposing their regulations onto large companies who are then being forced into a policing role and getting that regulation out to their supply chain. And that's because we're not going to achieve any sort of ESG ambitions without a whole supply chain. There's no point one company just doing it and putting it on their website, and we're not actually moving the dial. So whether it's modern slavery or carbon footprint or recycled materials, it's really all linked. So the paper that we put into Treasury ahead of the roundtable focused on modern slavery, not because we've got any problem with the Act as it is, but just because it's the most mature. The Act requires very large companies to report on what they are doing to remove any examples or evidence or suspicion of modern slavery in their entire supply chain. And, there are many countries that have these rules, the UK, Canada, etc. Thailand has one. So, you can get some international take-up. But the problem is that in a very vague way, it asks these large companies to also certify that their small, well, not small, any size supplier is also making moves to reduce the evidence of forced labour in their supply chain. So if you're a small company and you supply to two big companies, so potentially, let's say you're a food manufacturer and you supply to the two big retailers, then you're going to receive a questionnaire on a different platform. Similar questions were not exactly the same, different timing, depending on their, certainty index and appetite for risk. You may get a third-party audit that you may or may not choose, and you probably have to pay for. And so we really think that this is now starting to become too burdensome for companies. One of our members, a food manufacturer with about 50 employees, estimates that they spend around $500,000 a year in direct and indirect costs to comply. And that, of course, is just the direct cost. That's just the direct impact. It doesn't reflect the opportunity cost of this distraction. If the government was actually doing this regulation on small business, they would shape it to capability. They would shape it to the risk profile. There'd be a lot of ways that they would reduce the burden. And more importantly, they'd only do it once. The problem is that large companies can't talk to each other. And in this case, we point to two issues that we could address. One is the Modern Slavery Act itself, and it could be more disciplined. There is a current review on the Act that we'll be working on getting a submission into, but also the Competition Act, because as I said, ESG ambitions, no one is saying that we shouldn't do these things. They are all really important. One of the challenges is that you're never actually compliant because you always have to show progress. They are progressive policies, and which means that it's never a set and forget. The problem is that our current Competition Act doesn't actually allow large companies to work together to talk about these things. I mean, they can, under product stewardship, you have to put in application. It can take some time. We get asked for our opinion, so we put in a submission. I mean, this is a classic abundance case where there's a whole lot of performance around submissions and approvals, which eventually all gets approved anyway. It's very time consuming. The lawyers have a fun time. And the outcome isn't, I don't think the outcome's that different than if they could just pick up the phone and talk to each other. And one of the things that we are looking at, I understand in the UK, they have a platform to resolve this. They just have a platform that SMEs put in all their data and then the large companies have to get it. And that reduces some of the burden. We're not saying companies shouldn't have to report because, we're all on the same side here, but it does have to be ideally once and a light touch.
As we get to the end of the session, I also think we should, it's almost become customary for us to do the Trump update for the fortnight. So both Louise and I were kept up at night a bit last night with the suggestion that Trump would be raising the tariffs even higher. And it may have invalidated everything we've given you fortnightly on the podcast up until now. But Louise, I think the good news is there's nothing to report just yet, despite what you might have read in the newspaper yesterday.
That's right. I had another briefing with DFAT this morning. I guess in this case, no news is good news. That the challenge for Australia is that we're not high on the list, but we can. I mean, apparently Canada and Mexico both have 0 on the table. The UK, of course, has 10% on the table. We can't just sit quietly and wait for our rate to go up to 25%, 20%. The problem is, though, all the senior negotiators, are the ones we want to talk to, are all in Stockholm trying to deal with the Chinese. And I hear that those negotiations have just been extended again. I mean, Jeff, it takes years to do a proper free trade agreement. I just don't know how they expect to do these things in, is it 8? Well, actually, it's not 8 weeks, is it? Because we were here in April. So that's 3 months we're in now. It just feels like 100 years.
Well, Louise, your and my favourite free trade agreement, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, was 27 years from initial proposal by Mahathir in 1993 till we got it. So, 8 weeks is a pretty good, punishing schedule. It may not be that comprehensive, however.
No, and I blame India for that lengthy delay. Anyway.
Oh, you'd only blame them for 10 of the 27, surely. There's a couple of us.
All right. Well, only because we had such high ambition, and which was never met. Anyway, we should close up here because once I get on my rant about RCEP will never end. Thanks, Jeff.
I've started something I shouldn't start. Yeah, I know.
So thanks. That's all we've got time for. As I said, next fortnight I'll be on leave, which, wasn't great. I booked it and then the Prime Minister announced the roundtable. But anyway, the team's all working hard. We'll get there. Jeff, you're going to talk to David and Tennant around climate and R&D. If you found this podcast via the AO Group website, please do subscribe on your usual platform. And if they let you leave a review, please do take time to leave one because we love all positive feedback. My name's Louise McGrath. I've been joined by Jeff Wilson. If you have any comments or questions, please email us at industry.policy@aogroup.com.au and we'll speak again soon. Thanks.